Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Rare Book Room. My name is Nicholas. I help direct the events here at the Strand. For a little bit of history, the Strand was founded in 1927 over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled until after over 92 years, Strand is the sole survivor, still run by the Bass family, who was the founders I may have mentioned, still running 400 events a year, including this one, and housing new and used books. Tonight we once again celebrate the annual launch of Best American Comics with a star-studded panel of contributors to this year's collection. Your panelists for this evening include poet and comic/zines publisher E.A. Bethea, Ignatz-nominated cartoonist and illustrator Xia Gordon, Brazilian illustrator and cartoonist Laura Lannes, award-winning author of Present and Eye of the Majestic Creature, Leslie Stein, and author of multiple books and the comic strip Normal Person, Lauren Weinstein. Moderating tonight's conversation is Best American Comics editor and friend of the Strand, Bill Kartalopoulos. Bill is a comics critic, educator, curator, and editor who teaches courses about comics at Parsons and at SVA. He has curated exhibits about comics internationally and is the programming director for the MoCCA Arts Festival. We are very grateful to have so many incredible talents here in this room, so please help me in welcoming all of our panelists and moderator Bill to the Strand.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thanks to the Strand for hosting this event, and to Emma Gordon from Houghton Mifflin Harcourt for Strand to make this event happen. Is this working? Oh, yeah, it's just a little low. Got it. Okay, thank you so much to everyone for being here, both our incredible panelists and everyone who came to the event. Tonight we're celebrating the 2019 edition of the Best American Comics, an annual volume published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. What I'd like to do tonight is just for a few minutes talk a little bit about the series, what it is and how it works, and then I'll just be asking each of our panelists a few questions about their work so that we can hear from them both about the work that they have in this year's volume and about their work overall. So Best American Comics, as some of you may know very well, is one of a number of annual Best American titles published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. So this is kind of a line of annual series that includes things like the Best American Short Stories, the Best American Mystery Stories, the Best American Essays, etc. And these are all anthologies that come out each fall that compile a selection of outstanding material from each particular genre chosen from work that was previously published the year before. And these Best American titles actually have a fairly deep history. The book that became the Best American Short Stories started publishing in 1915 during World War I. So the series in some form has been happening for and being published annually for more than a century. The Best American Comics is one of several other Best American titles that came along later. In fact, the Best American Comics started being published in 2006. This is the first Best American Comics from 2006. At that time, Anne Elizabeth Moore was in my role as the series editor, and the first guest editor in the Best American Comics series was Harvey P. Carr, who's now deceased, the autobiographical comics writer. And I kind of like considering those two volumes side by side because I do feel like you get a real short summary of the story of comics and their relationship to the literary field in America. That it took about 100 years for comics to be admitted into the club as part of the world of literary publishing. But nevertheless, here they are now. We have had Best American Comics coming out since 2006, and here we all are now at the Strand in the beautiful Rare Books room talking about this year's volume. Now, Best American Comics functions in the same way as all of these Best American series. And the way they work is a little bit complicated, but I think it's a pretty good system in that it really gives these series a chance to consider a broad range of work and compile it in a way that will be hopefully surprising and interesting for any kind of reader. I can talk a little bit about my own role. All of these titles, these Best American titles, have a series editor, which is what I am, the series editor for Best American Comics. And the series editor works on the book for multiple volumes. I've been in that role since the 2014 volume. And each year I work with a special guest editor. The special guest editor for this year's volume is the artist Jillian Tamaki. Other people have served in that role. So my job as series editor is to basically all year long look for and read comics to consider for selection for the next year's edition. And the primary way that work comes to me is through an open submission policy. All of these Best American titles have an open submission policy. And that definitely means that there is a large volume of work that comes in the door that the series editors for these books have to look at and consider, which is great, because it really truly means that anything theoretically can get into the Best American Comics. Anything that arrives as a submission is seriously considered for inclusion. On top of that, of course, in my role as series editor, I go to comics festivals, I reach out to publishers and ask them to send in their work. I kind of keep my radar on. I spend a lot of time on social media. I'll reach out to individual artists who are self-publishing and ask them to contribute their work for consideration. I spend certainly a fair bit of time on the internet looking at comics that are posted online, whether it's on an online magazine or on Tumblr or Instagram or anything else. I'm basically always looking for anything that I think we should have in our pool of material for consideration. So basically, I end up with a lot of comics in any given year, many, many hundreds of comics that I seriously consider. And then what I do is I boil down the many hundreds of comics that I've managed to get my hands on to a pool of about 120 or 130 pieces that I send to the special guest editor each year. And then the guest editor is the person who makes the final choices as to what goes into the book each year. And I should also add, too, that it's not just that they're choosing from material that I'm pre-selecting. In every case, I've always communicated a lot with the guest editor to find out what kind of material they're interested in seeing, if there's any book they want me to find for them, or any artist they're interested in, or any type of work that they want. And then on top of that, the guest editor does have the freedom to bring in work that they may have discovered on their own. But what I do is certainly kind of prepare the ground for them to then be in a good position to consider a broad range of work and then make selections that constitute the final choices for each year's Best American Comics series. So essentially that process that we see in these Best American titles, where there's a series editor and a guest editor, I think it does a number of things. I think it allows the book to have some functional continuity from year to year by having a person in the job who has gained some experience doing this work. But on the other hand, I think it keeps the book from being too repetitive, from becoming stale. It's just representing the same point of view over and over again. And I think one of the other things that's really good about having these guest editors is that, and I think this applies across all of the Best American titles, if one is to compile a group of anything and say it's the best of the previous year, no matter how much care and thought goes into that, obviously there's a strong element of subjectivity involved in that. No two people are ever going to agree on what the best of anything is. And I think having a different person in the role each year, whether it's Jillian Tamaki this year or Phoebe Gleckner the year before or whoever else has been in that role, I think what it really does is it acknowledges and makes a strength of that subjectivity. It says, yes, it's subjective. And part of the appeal of the book is that each year you get to see someone else's different subjective take on what's good and interesting in contemporary comics. And I think that's a lot of what makes the book interesting from year to year, is that every year you see some notion of what's been happening in the past year of comics that's interesting as seen from the perspective of a different person. So that you can, from year to year, you can see Scott McCloud's approach is very different from Roz Chast's approach, which is very different from, Ben Catcher's approach, which is different from Phoebe Gleckner's approach, and so on and so forth. So I think actually that's a real strength of the series, that it sort of, in a way, acknowledges that compiling a group of work together and calling it the best of anything is necessarily going to be subjective. So let's take a strength out of that. Let's make a strength out of that subjectivity. And I did just want to briefly say a couple of things about Jillian Tamaki, who is this year's guest editor. Has anyone read any of Jillian Tamaki's books here in the audience? I see some hands, some people have, maybe some others haven't. I was really glad to work with Jillian Tamaki this year because I think in her work as an artist, she kind of represents a lot of the different things that comics and visual narrative can do and are doing today. She's the co-author of two graphic novels for younger readers. One is called Skim, and the other is called This One Summer. In both cases, they're both written by her cousin, the writer Mariko Tamaki, and drawn by Jillian. She's produced a number of other works, including Boundless, which is a collection of short comics for adult readers, Super Mutant Magic Academy, which started out as an online comic and then was collected as a printed book. She's done work for children, including the children's book They Say Blue, which is really quite lovely, and you can see sort of combines some of the formal elements of comics and picture books together. Even if you're not aware of Jillian's books, you might have seen her work around. She's a frequent illustrator in the New York Times. If you've used the MTA subway system over the last several years, you might have literally seen her work around. She did one of those, I don't know what they call them, like, it's not poetry in motion, so I guess it's art in motion. Those horizontal illustrated images that show up in the MTA cars. She did one a couple years ago called Transit. And one of the things that I really loved about it was that she actually used that peculiar horizontal space to draw a comic strip about people waiting at the subway, waiting for the train, and then finally rushing to catch it. So I was always very happy to enter into a subway car that had one of those up on there. She's been in Best American Comics before. She did the cover for the 2011 edition. So I was very happy to work with her today. No, not today, but this past year, rather, as guest editor. Because, like I said, I think a lot of the range of what she covers in her own work represents the range of what's happening in comics today. Similarly, I think our group of panelists, who we're going to be hearing from now, will also, in their way, suggest the range of work that people are making in comics today. So I'd like to turn to our panelists and hear from them. I'll be going in alphabetical order today. So first, I'd like to talk to Elizabeth Bethea about her piece that's in this year's volume of Best American Comics. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hold on. Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right.
So Elizabeth's comic is called Bit Rot. This is a 2-page comic. Can you talk just a little bit very generally about what this piece is about?
Well, the phenomenon of bit rot is like digital disintegration, like of files or, and so I go kind of deeper into like body disintegration, disintegration of the mind. Sort of, I was thinking about this comic, it doesn't take place in any particular place. It's all very mental. There's just sort of a lot of rushing thoughts. And it starts off with a question about where will my emails go, like after I die. Like I have I have like a Yahoo account, from like, it was like my first email account. And I still use it. I have other email accounts, so if you want to hire me, I have a Gmail account. What was I saying? Anyway, it's about that kind of disintegration, and kind of even breaks down, I think, linguistically in that the sixth panel, you read it, it's 2 pages left to right, where I'm sort of breaking down Pontchartrain, which is a lake in New Orleans, and how it has different, it has a bridge, a pont, and a train, and a chart, a map, and so it breaks. Can you hear me? Hold it better. Anyway, any other questions?
What
do you think about it, Bill?
No, I like it quite a bit, and I think I feel like you've somehow developed an approach to comics that's all your own, and I'm actually kind of curious just about how you develop this way of making comics, because it almost feels like often, you like you were saying, like this story doesn't take place in a particular place. It feels just like this kind of writerly rumination that's providing the text, but then there are also these images, and often your drawings are not necessarily like, they're specific, but they're not like figurative in the sense that you're not drawing like characters moving through space. They're like, you're often drawing like pictures of things or of mental images or memories, or maybe even pictures of things from media, like from television or magazines or something like that. There's
not like a person, is what you're, like there's not, generally I feel like I try to have a voice that is all of us, it's like very inclusive. And that's like the way that I'm relating to you and you're relating to me. Like we can like inhabit this space together on this page, And I like that concept. So a lot of times when I do draw people, I mean, here we've got the governor of New York and his father, who was also the governor of New York, the Cuomos, which gets kind of into this repetition that I get into. It sort of turns into a litany at the end of just a lot of, what's going to be left of me, and there's excavators that are finding my boxer shorts, and, and then it ends with Charlie Mingus, with a composition he wrote called Myself When I Am Real, and it's like one of my, if you don't know it, just go home. It's on Spotify. It's like a wonderful piano track, and it's just sort of I think the piece ultimately is like trying to distill down from all of this stuff we have. We have all this ephemera, digital ephemera, this stuff that's kind of like holding us down. But if we can just kind of distill it down to this really kind of subterranean of the mind, where the very inner coil of the brain or something, I think is always where I'm trying to get, usually by the last panel, I want to be in a place that's very personal, but with you, That's the idea.
Yeah.
It's sort of the same idea as a poem, A poem is supposed to kind of just connect us, and like by the end, we're like transformed, So. That's what I want to do. It doesn't always happen, but.
I think I first saw your work in this book called Bethea's Illustrated. I remember seeing it for sale, I believe, at one bookstore, Spoonbill in Sugartown.
Yeah, that was like where it was for sale.
In Williamsburg.
Because I worked in a coffee shop next to those guys, and so I was like.
Oh, at Verb when that was.
Yeah, I worked at the Verb for way too long.
Artisanal soap shop.
I worked in coffee for way too long.
Yeah, and at the time I was living in Williamsburg in like this big space with like 7 roommates, and I didn't even buy the book, but someone else did, and it was just kind of like floating around the apartment, and but that was where I first saw your work, and it just felt like this thing that almost like some of the things you draw in your comics, just like this thing I came across that like somehow found its way into my house. And I had, like, you know, I hadn't seen your work before, and I just felt like you had your own way of making comics. How did you come to make this book?
My friend Gerard, he died, I think, in 2012. He was in the band TV on the Radio, and he was the bassist. But he had a bunch of my zines, and he was always like, "We should make a book. We should make a book." And then when he started, you know, playing guitar for Scarlett Johansson and things like that, he's like, "I have some scratch," and so then we made the book. So we made 300 copies of this book. And it was like perfect bound, and I think I see how many 88 pages. Yeah.
88 pages.
Yeah. And we were both really proud of it. You know, it had basically all of my work I had collected. I'd probably been doing comics since '99.
Okay.
So we just collected it together. A lot of that stuff I wish I could take out of my, you know, if you look at your earlier work and you're like, oh, this is just kind of stupid, or about like getting fucked up, or like, you know, I wish I could sort of take that out of my own personal canon, you know, but it's out there, and, you know, it's cool. So I was in my 20s and I was young, you know.
You had been doing zines, and I guess, I mean, a lot of
there's great stuff in there too. Like, I'm not discrediting it totally, but yeah.
And a lot of the stuff that I've seen from you since then has been still in self-published zines, including the piece that's in this book.
Yeah, like I would love a book deal or something.
Right. No, but I mean, as being part of a self-publishing
it's kind of how I've done it. I mean, some zines I've made only like 20 copies of, you know. I think you put me, I think in 2012, in the notables list of best American comics, Bill puts like a list in the back of notables that don't make the book. And it was for a zine I'd only made like 20 copies of.
Was that Faded Frankenstein?
Faded Frankenstein, yeah. You know? Yeah.
And you do have one publication that's in a larger quantity too, which is Book of Days. That came out a year or two ago, I think, with a mix of...
End of 2017, published by Domino Books, which is Austin English's press. He's always been, you know, he reached out to me years ago. You know, there's certain people that I've met in the comics world that have really just like helped foster me taking myself seriously as a comic artist. Like I just was always sort of doing it for myself and handing it to my friends. And then I felt like at some point I was like, you know, people seem to enjoy these, and I should, you know, I'm still not out there enough, I think, in terms of getting them out in the world. But Austin was very important, and Josh Bayer as well was someone who just sort of reached out to me early and was like, you know, I really like your stuff, like keep doing this stuff, you know, which is sometimes all you need to keep doing your stuff, you know. Yeah. Otherwise it's just for the drawer, you know.
Now I just wanted, I mean, because this is so small, I did, I mean, just the images are so small on the screen. I have a few images that I took off of your website that are a little bit larger, just so people can get a better sense. And I'm just always, I really just, I mean, I really just appreciate this kind of mix of like poetic language and humor and references to pop culture. But like you said, it always ends up in like a really personal place. It's like a specific person is having a feeling, but it's also a feeling that other people can relate to too.
Yeah, I hope is universal, you know.
I just also, I appreciated just the kind of poetic irony of this beer called Warm Milk that says serve cold on it.
That'll be in my next book, which is coming out for Comic Arts Brooklyn. So that's, I think, November 2nd at Pratt.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Xia, I'd like to ask you a few questions about your work as well. So the piece that Jillian selected to include in Best American Comics is an excerpt from a longer, I think 32-page comic called Kindling. And that's another aspect of Best American Comics, is that, you know, often we do excerpt work just in the interests of having more than like 10 pieces in the book. But I thought, and I hope you think so, that this was a nice self-contained little piece of that longer book. But Kindling is such an interesting book. This is printed in 2-color risograph. And in fact, actually, I don't know, does anyone in the audience know what risograph is? Probably about half. Do you want to just briefly tell them what that is?
I mean, can you guys hear me? I know very little myself of the process, but it's a printing method where you, I guess you expose layers like you would screen printing, and that's printed. It's great because you can print like huge quantities of it really quickly. That's pretty much all I know about Resign.
Okay. Yeah, it's an interesting process that's sort of almost like halfway between silk screen and Xerox somehow.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, but it has some odd qualities, like the registration's never quite perfect, and it gets a little fuzzy sometimes on the paper that takes that particular kind of ink very well.
Yeah, I love that stuff. I love that, like, kind of having to let go of the exactness of the printing. It adds really interesting stuff to it.
And this is a piece that is, it feels very elusive, like there's some like inclinations about a kind of narrative, or intimations rather, about a kind of narrative situation, but it's not super specific either. And sometimes the images really become very abstract in this piece. Can you talk a little bit about what you were thinking about when you started working on Kindling?
Sure. When I started working on Kindling, I was approached to make the book by a publisher called 2D Cloud, and they really I hadn't been making comics. I was focusing on illustration, so I think I attacked it in a very like illustration-y, like editorial way, which is I decided what my prompt was, like what issue I wanted to solve in making the book. And at that point, I had been dealing with just trying to understand my own behavior and my tendency to like self-sabotage and be overly self-sacrificing. And so I guess Kindling was just my way of trying to like visualize that behavior.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you were working on illustration at the time that you started making Kindling, and you know, it's so interesting to hear you say that you kind of, in a way, like approached it like an illustration project. But what's also interesting to me, anyway, is that the style, the visual style that you use in this book is quite different from the examples of your illustration work that you have online, which are very precise and quite figurative. For example, this is a Google Doodle. Was this for Martin Luther King Jr. Day?
Yeah.
And I think is this the film Midsummer?
It is.
Okay. And this also has a little GIF animation kind of quality to it. And you know, these are just a few examples of your illustration work. So I'm kind of interested in the relationship, I guess, between the visual approaches that are in your illustration work and how you developed your visual approach in Kindling. Do you also, is the work in Kindling in some ways like personal work that you do, or was that just almost something that you developed to address that narrative in a way that felt more emotional somehow than perhaps the illustration assignment?
I think it wasn't very calculated at all. Because I had no experience making comics, I basically went into it thinking I'm gonna do whatever feels the most honest and the most like intuitive. So I tried to like break every rule that I had picked up or thought I picked up from reading other comics, and just wanted to like just really play with what I thought comics were, which is something I don't feel like I have that much room for experimentation in illustration, because you have a story that you need to tell, and that's pretty much it, you know. So comics has been a space for like experimentation for me completely. Yeah.
And I think, I could be wrong, but I think your most recent comic is this one, Tuning?
It is.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And can you, you had mentioned on your site that this is based on, I guess, diaristic writing or note-taking. Can you talk a little bit about how you developed this piece?
Sure. So Tuning, it's kind of, it's very similar. I made it in a way very similar to how I made Kindling, which is kind of collaging my own writing and sort of like found material and sketches that might have gotten rejected from an illustration job, or like something that I started and didn't finish, and just sort of found a place for them in this collection of my own personal stories. There's like some poetry in here, and there's some daily journaling that I've been trying to do. So it's kind of a mixed bag. Yeah.
Okay. So do you think that this kind of work has allowed you to maybe do things that illustration doesn't allow you to do, like write or process personal things in a way that's different from just single image making alone?
For sure, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there are editorial jobs where I've been able to like incorporate some text, like single comic pages or stuff like that. But again, this is just another way to sort of let loose and just do whatever I want, make whatever I want to make. Yeah.
And it seems like there are a few things happening, and part of it is that comics are just longer than a single images. It's a bunch of
Right.
images, so you develop an idea. Part of it is the combination of writing an image, and then part of it is being like working within small press versus working for Google or whatever the illustration client might be.
Right, the stakes are much lower.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, as quite often are the rewards, unfortunately.
Right.
But
I think it's reward enough to like be able to like vomit out this thing that you've
Exactly.
been dealing with and have it be experienced by other people.
Well, and that's the nice thing about this work, is that the overhead for making it exist is very low beyond the time that it takes to make the work.
Exactly,
I
yeah.
mean, I mean, this one of the reasons people like risograph is because it is acceptable. Like the zines. The zine that Elizabeth made that we excerpted or took, reprinted bit rot from I think that was just photocopied, right? Was that?
Which one?
The all killer, no filler.
yeah.
Yeah, it's just photocopied black and white zines. And so, that's one of the things that I think is very valuable and precious about small press publishing and self-publishing.
And it's very immediate too, so it's kind of just like thought to thing
Yeah.
that exists. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's also something that's different from mainstream book publishing. Like, a lot of what is here at the Strand, where work is solicited in a catalog like a year before it comes
Right.
out, and publishing cycles are very slow and long term. So do you think you'll continue incorporating this kind of comics making as part of a personal practice alongside your professional practice?
Yeah, I think I need to. It like frees up, because I have this space to like also make really bad work in the self-published stuff, and to see like what people respond to and kind of what people hate, and I can transfer that knowledge into the higher stake stuff.
Great. And you had mentioned this is published by a publisher called 2D Cloud, and actually, Laura, your piece was published by 2D Cloud as well. So the piece that...
I'm not with them anymore.
Right, we're both not with 2D Cloud anymore.
Oh, okay. But this piece is that's in Best American Comics is excerpted from a book called "By Monday I'll Be Floating in the Hudson with the Other Garbage," and this is also 2 color. Can you, just for anyone who hasn't seen it before, just briefly tell people what this book is about?
Yeah. Is this? Oh, this comic is from, I think, February 2017, and it's a collection of diary comics. I was posting them online, about a page a day, and I started making them. I've made diary comics before, and things in my life were kind of going south, and I thought, this is gonna be very good for my comics. So I started to write everything down, and I was seeing a guy who had a girlfriend, but she had moved to Detroit and decided to only date women. And I thought that was that things were looking up for me, but he wanted to stay with her, and that's when I started making the comics.
So yeah, this is kind of interesting because I actually didn't know that this had been an online comic previously. I saw this when it was printed, but at the same time, even within the book itself, there are some references that you make to like making pages and posting them and things like that. Were you posting them on like your personal website, or was this on a social media platform?
Yeah, I was posting everything on Twitter and Instagram. I was using like scrap paper that I had. I wasn't expecting this to go anywhere. It was very much something I was doing for myself, just to vomit it out somewhere, you know.
And then eventually it was collected in this oversized book. And I want to ask you a couple of questions about it first, but I think the first piece of yours that I saw from a few years ago was this comic called The Basel Plan. This was a kind of interesting comic because, and to me it's interesting to think about it in comparison to by Monday I'll be floating in the Hudson with all the other garbage, because this is one where it seems like it could be personal or it could be fictional, and either way, it definitely incorporates like fantasy imagery. Whereas the work that we're talking about here seems like super diaristic. Was this the first time that you had done something that was like that directly diaristic before, or were you already making work like that?
I had made diary comics before, but I think this was the one that went the longest, non-stop online, in real time. Yeah.
And it's funny because we were just talking a little bit about the some of the differences between being in like small press and being working with clients and things like that with Xia. And this was a situation where some of those factors came into play actually with Best American Comics, because the one thing that I can say is great about Best American Comics is we don't have any editorial interference in the work that we select to put in the book. It always 100% represents what the guest editor wants to do with the volume each year, except that every year there's like a lawyer who looks at the book. And we've run a lot of autobiographical comics in Best American Comics before, and like I never ever think that's a problem. But then like the weird thing that came up for the first time with this is that in this piece you have a lot of like transcriptions of text message conversations. And this lawyer was like, well, you can't have any of those pages because if someone sends you a text message, it's still their copyright. And you would have to ask permission to like run that person's text messages. So I felt bad about that, and we like selected pages that didn't have that in there. But you bring up the issue of like representing other people in this comic a lot. Like there's one character who you draw as a dog because they didn't want to be in your comic. how is that, has that been like an issue for you, this question of like documenting your own life in ways that involve a lot of like depictions of other people?
Yeah, I feel like that's just a problem that comes with making autobiographical work. Besides trying not to portray myself as the hero of the story, you know, like something happens and it doesn't go well, but then in my comic, I'm like, well, the jerk store is running out of you know what I mean? Like I have like a good comeback. People have very different interpretations of events that you share with them. And the guy that I made this comic mostly about has a very different take on it from mine. And he was not happy with the comics. And I got him to agree to me publishing the comic with a publisher that was small. It was a short run. It was only 500 copies. And I said, and that's it. I hope he doesn't find out about this. Because it's true. I really wanted to be truthful in the comic, and I put the text messages and the emails, and those are all his copyright. So we had to cut several pages from the original excerpt for Best American Comics, because I don't, you know, I've been making diary comics for a while, and there's only so many times you can get threatened with a lawsuit before you back down preemptively, you know. And I feel like I escaped something also by giving someone else a dog head. You don't know who that is, you know. Yeah, I don't know. It's a constant issue when you deal with real people and portraying them and sharing their life. Because just because I decided to expose myself in this way doesn't mean that people in my life did.
Yeah, it's very difficult. It's an interesting question. It's I do feel like that the fact that we have so much digital communication now has really changed it, because people have been doing autobiographical comics and other kind of autobiographical work forever, but it's like if you're sort of reconstructing a conversation with someone else, you never remember exactly what somebody else said, so you're just representing your memory of what that conversation was or something. And I mean, I think that people do have the right as artists to represent their own lives, and I feel like in some weird way, you know, if that is truly what, like, you know, the law says, it's really out of sync with what artists, I think, need to do personally. But I mean, there are a lot of, you know, thorny questions around that kind of thing, and I guess it does, you know, suggest the value of anthropomorphic characters or something. You also, in addition to doing comics, you do a lot of illustration as well. Was this one also a Google Doodle? What was this one for?
This is, I'm from Brazil. This is for the Brazilian women's soccer team for when they played in the World Cup.
And this is another editorial assignment that you did for the, this is the New York Times. How do you see, or do you see, or how would you describe the relationship between making drawings for your illustration work and making work for your narrative work in comics?
I think it's very complicated. It used to be very clear cut in my head. This is comics and it's for me, and it's gonna be funny or raunchy or something. And this is illustration work, which should be very, you know, an attempt at sophistication, and I want to sell this and I want to be approved. But I've been doing illustration for a while now, and it completely contaminated my comics work. It's like I started drawing because it was what I enjoyed most, but then I made it my way to make a living, and with that came a lot of stress and a lot of insecurity, and changing my style to please several different clients. You know, I feel like when I look at my portfolio, it's such a mishmash. And eventually I got to the point where I don't even know what I want to draw for my comics anymore. But I'm talking to you now from the middle of a burnout. I'm trying to figure it out and separate it again, but right now it feels too close. Does that make sense?
It's interesting that you talked about the illustration affecting your comics, because the last comic of yours that I've read seems called John Deere. I did notice that like the images seemed like you were I kind of had a sense, not that you were having an issue, but rather that you were maybe synthesizing aspects of what you did as an illustrator with aspects of what you do in your narrative work. Is this the kind of thing you're talking about when you describe the illustration infecting the comics?
I guess so. I mean, this style is so radically different from the style in By Monday. Mm-hmm. And I feel like I went that direction and then I went this direction. And these two comics came out the same year. Mm-hmm. And they look nothing alike. I don't know, I don't know what's me. I don't know what I want to do. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I don't want to be grim, but it feels like I have to step away from one or the other. Mm-hmm. Because it's too confused in my head. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I feel like some people are really good at separating, like, this is my fun time drawing and this is my work drawing. But to me, it just got to a point where I would dread going to the drafting table. I wish I had something better to say. I'm just pretty depressed.
Well, one thing I could say is I know a lot of artists have been through that and eventually do get through the other side instead of stopping drawing forever. So I think that the strength of the range of what you do is so impressive that I hope you're able to find pleasure in it again.
Me too. I think a lot about Eleanor Davis, mm-hmm. who's also in the book, because she is a really amazing cartoonist, and she also does illustration. And I've seen her post online so many times over the years about not drawing, about not enjoying drawing, and then she just won't do it for a while. Mm-hmm. And just thinking about how Eleanor Davis did it makes me feel like it's fine for me to do it, mm-hmm. and just not draw, and just not do it until I want to and feel like I have to do it, because really it's not like comics is really good money and I can't stop doing it. It's really the opposite. My life has gone better since I stopped. So I feel like I'm only gonna pick it up again when it feels like an urge. I don't feel like I have to make comics. I feel like online people crucify themselves about not drawing or not making comics because you have to. And I used to be a babysitter, and I never babysat a kid who had to do piano practice that went on to love playing the piano and just be a pianist. You know, they usually quit piano lessons as soon as they can, you know, advocate for themselves.
No, it's true. And we're in the middle of Inktober, which is, I think, the peak of people beating themselves up online for not drawing enough and so on. Yeah. Which, anyway. Well, I'd like to ask Leslie a couple of questions because your work also, I mean, kind of like what Laura was just saying, like your work has really changed a lot, and it seems like it's sort of changed its function, but it's changed its visual style a lot too over the years that I've been aware of it. The piece that's in the Best American Comics is called Vanguard, and it's an autobiographical, full-color piece about the first time you went to the Village Vanguard, right? Mm-hmm. I've actually never been there myself, even though I've walked by it a million times. And this is from this is collected in a book called Present. Although I think were most of the pieces in Present originally online on the Vice website?
Yeah, it was I had a weekly comic on Vice.
Okay, and I mean, this first of all, this is just a lovely piece. Are you working with ink and watercolor or pencil and watercolor with this material?
So it's microns and watercolor. There's also colored pencil, gouache, jelly pens, like whatever I can get my hand on. I actually live across the street from an art supply store, which opened after I moved in. So I go in there and I look around, and this looks like fun. Like maybe this can change my style. So I'm always just trying to like push myself, and even if I make a mistake on the page, I'll learn something from it, and something else will come out on another page where that mistake becomes a positive change.
Mm-hmm. Well, and even in this piece, you almost say exactly that, because you depict yourself giving a lesson or a workshop to, I think, at a comics festival type situation, and then sort of relearning that lesson for yourself in a way.
Right. So I was asked to do a workshop in Chicago, and I'm also a musician, and I try to think about rhythm a lot and how I draw comics, and what I'm listening to at the time often really gives me an emotional feeling that I try to transmit on the page. So when I didn't know what to do for the workshop, and what they had an idea they had, well, why don't you do something that incorporates music? So I was like, okay, and I set up all these kind of abstract prompts for people to do, listening to certain like jazz songs and stuff like that. And I was kind of telling them, just to get them to loosen up at the beginning of the class, does not matter what you do. It's just about a feeling. Just move your pen around and just see what the materials can do. So then that week, I had to relearn my own lesson, because I had always wanted to go to the Village Vanguard and draw to live jazz. So first of all, at this time, I was wondering when this came out, if someone would mention this, which they haven't yet, because I was saying, I can't find it, I'm going to give up and go home. But most people just look at their phones. But at this point, I didn't have a smartphone. So I eventually ran into the Village Vanguard. I went downstairs, and I talked to one of the waiters, and I said, like, where can I draw that has some light? And he's like, nowhere has light. I mean, it's a jazz club. It's going to be like pitch black. And I was like, all right, I'm going to do it anyways. So, the music started, and I just had to tell myself, like, it's just about a feeling. Like, I can't make out these colors, but I'm having fun, and I'm doing what I'm practicing what I preach or whatever. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, and
that's that story.
Yeah, and this is I think the second volume of work that you have that's like these autobiographical full color pieces, right? Mm-hmm. And the first one was called Bright Eyed at Midnight, I think.
Yeah, mm-hmm. That was a collection of, I did a page a day. And really didn't expect anyone to see them, just threw them on, like Tumblr, I think was the thing at the time. It was like 2014. Mm-hmm. And I thought, like, no one's going to see this, so I'll just like have fun and mess around. And then, like, one thing that was interesting about it, I was having a hard time as well, but through that exercise, I was getting in contact with people who were saying, like, this is helping me, and that was giving me a purpose to go on and find a community and feel happy about doing these pieces and feel like there's a gift portion of them, which, the title represents kind of a dual meaning with that and with being in the moment. So through that lesson of, drawing every day in this style and using different materials, and sometimes it'd be more abstract and sometimes it'd be more figurative, I kind of decided like the best thing to do for me was to do 5 pages at a time in a more concrete style, but still a little abstract. And so I did that for a couple of years for Vice.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting point, because the work of yours that I first read was a series called Eye of the Majestic Creature. And it's just been so interesting, and that's been collected into 3 books as well so far. And I don't know if you're still doing this work or not, because I think that your last couple of books have been the autobio stuff, but it's been really interesting to see the difference between those 2 styles of work, because the Eye of the Majestic Creature stuff is super, like, I mean, it has a similarity, but it's very like concrete, black and white, like very, very, very kind of precisely detailed with like, a lot of like, stippling and line work. And the characters seem, I think it's tempting to assume that there's, in some way grounded in real experience, because it's about like a person living in New York and living day-to-day life. But even if it is, it's like fictionalized to the point where it doesn't matter. Whereas this is like direct and autobiographical, but the style is also like way more abstract. And I don't know, does it make, like, what do you think about the relationship between those 2 things, like using precise imagery for fiction and more abstracted imagery for like work that's depicted as nonfiction in some way?
I think that I just get bored really easily, and the black and white comic that I was working on, I worked on that series for 10 years, and it sometimes took me about 20 hours just to do 1 page, and a lot of stippling, and I just felt like I want to do something different. And before that style, I had another style that was just about collage work. So I would try to figure out, I was trying to figure out interesting compositions on the page to keep myself, give myself challenges so it's not boring, it's not just labor. So I think that it's just that I'm going to continue to keep changing and growing, just because otherwise I would be bored and it would seem more like labor than, making art, taking chances.
And you recently posted an image about a current project called I Know You Writer.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, I will. That's funny. That's from my Instagram, and we were trying to figure out. I work with this editor at Drawn and Quarterly called Tracy Huron, who's awesome, and she helped me with my last book with the little circles on top, and we did a die-cut cover, so you'd open it, and it would explode into color, and it's like, welcome to my mind, But this one is more. This is very straightforward. I guess it'd probably be considered like my first graphic novel, because it's just 1 story that's 130 pages. And this image was because she sent me different things to work around to try to get me to figure out how, basically how the cover was going to look. So I just went to a bar and tried to have fun with it, and just sketching over different things. So I'm just finishing editing this week, and it comes out next year. So.
Okay, great. Okay. Lauren, the piece that you have is a piece that was on the New Yorker's website. This is the piece that's running in this year's Best American Comics. And actually, it didn't even occur to me until you mentioned it the other day that this is the first time you've seen it in print, because it was just on the New Yorker's website. And it's very interesting, the kind of permeability between making work for the internet and making it for print and vice versa. I mean, Laura was talking about how she was serializing her work online, but I think, I didn't see it until it was published as a book. This is something that only exists on the New Yorker's, I guess, website, and now in Best American Comics. But can you talk a little bit about this piece? I know it's based on your encounter with a painting. Can you briefly explain what is behind this?
Makes me smile looking at that painting. Well, the story starts where I see this painting online, and it just, I'm nursing at the time, so I'm like, this is this amazing picture, and I feel like this kinship with this artist, and who is this artist? And then it turns out this was painted in 1906. And thanks, Bill, for syncing this up so perfectly with my, and I just, and I was like, how come I haven't seen it before? And then it turns out I had seen it before. Yeah, this is great.
I don't have all the panels, just the first 6 or so, something like that.
And it, it seemed revolutionary because it wasn't like the classic mother and child pictures. And then I realized I actually had seen this work before. I had a catalog of this woman's work when I went to school for painting, and her name's Paula Modersohn Becker, and it turns out she was the first woman to paint herself naked, and when she painted herself naked, she was pregnant, and that was in 1907, and that was that really the first woman to ever paint herself naked? Of course not, but that was the first one that art historians recorded. And so I made this comic about, representation and ambition, and this one painter, and she died in childbirth, but she thought a lot about what it was going to be like to be a mother and being an artist. And then it talked about my own life in the comic, about how it is hard, and how things have changed, but also how things are similar. So that's basically what it's about. And it's just also about ambition as an artist. How to do ambitious work when there's all this other stuff going on, and who decides what is serious work. So there's a lot. It's 6 pages. But like you said, I never had seen this work in print. It was only online, and I made it both to be read sort of panel by panel, like you scroll down and you see a panel by panel, but I also made it so that you could, each page, you'd read them 6 pages. But I've been sort of working on, I love working in pencil, and actually younger cartoonists have shown me that you can do that. I started working, in the late 90s doing a comic strip for The Stranger in Seattle, a weekly newspaper. And I used ink just because that would print the best. But now I'm really taking inspiration from younger people, and using different media. And so this is, I know that certain things look good online, but I didn't know how well the graphite would reproduce in print, and it looks really good. We're really happy with it. I feel like you can do all the stuff, and it's really exciting for me. I'm working on a whole graphic novel in this style right now that I've been working on for 15 years, but finally this is the way I can work. So it's exciting.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I think that's an interesting thing where, in a weird way, the internet has, it has a variety of effects on art and how it gets made and distributed and seen and used. But I did notice that at a certain point, it felt I remember when Sam Alden started posting his work online, and particularly that piece, Hawaii 1997. I don't know if anyone has seen that. But that's just a comic that seems like it was drawn really fast and pencil in a moleskin notebook. And it's just scanned in, and you see all the texture in the paper, and just the subtle graphite, and just that kind of specific cream color of the moleskin paper. And then when it was printed in a book, it's just printed in grayscale, and it actually looks worse. And there's something about like the high-tech digital screen of the internet that actually made it really easy for people to like scan in like watercolor or colored pencil or graphite or even collage work or whatever, where would it be like really expensive to reproduce that well and technically complicated. But it's very, very easy to just slap something on a flatbed scanner and upload a high-res image to Tumblr or whatever the platform of the moment happens to be, which is kind of weird and interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there are a lot of tricks to it, I think, like not making graphite look mushy. Like I use a darker pencil, I up the, there's just a lot of technical stuff. And I also use digital color sometimes to kind of push the work forward.
Well, I think you mentioned your work on The Stranger, but I was thinking about your first book, Girl Stories, and the book that you're working on now is a kind of a spiritual sequel to Girl Stories, if I'm not mistaken. But a lot of this work was actually on like a really early website called girl.com, GURL. And it's kind of interesting because you're doing this work about like motherhood, whereas with the strips and girl.com, you're sort of writing about yourself as a kid, but at the same time you were older than your readers, so there were like examples where you found yourself in a kind of advice-giving position, for example.
Yeah, that was I did a comic called Am I Fat? And I got over like 10,000 emails from kids asking me if I thought they were fat. And I felt like I was like the end of the sort of black hole of, I don't think they knew when they were pressing that email button that they were actually just reaching me. And I didn't know exactly what to do, but I knew I did not like it. Like I didn't know how to, and I also knew that there was a kind of a way to manipulate the audience, because if you did a comic, so these comics went on America Online, and so they would just kind of be beamed right into a cajillion people's lives, and so I knew that making a comic called Am I Fat would really strike a nerve. and it did. And you know what sucks is that I feel like I really belittle that work because it was because I talked about women's issues, that I didn't take it seriously. But I think it's serious work. Like I hate that we're trained to devalue that work. I mean, it's all in. I didn't want to put out like a book of this teenage stuff because it wasn't my serious work. And I've worked for a really long time to kind of blend everything together so that they're all the same thing.
Well, yeah. So the Girl Story stuff wasn't like the kind of. I think some of this was on girl.com. Though,
yeah, a lot of it was. Yeah, the majority.
But I mean, it's sort of. Kind of memoiristic memories of your like adolescence, basically. Earlier when Nick was making the introduction, he mentioned your stripped normal person, and that seems like a space where, like you were just saying, you've kind of blended everything that you do together, or at least you were able to incorporate it all, because some of it is like you're responding to the moment, some of it's very specifically autobiographical, like about motherhood, like the New Yorker piece, or about teaching, and this is about teaching at SVA specifically, where I guess where Laura and Xia both went to school, and where you teach now. And then some of it is just kind of like the more surreal, humor that you were doing for The Stranger too.
Yeah.
And this, can you talk a little bit about Normal Person, what that was, and you're not still doing those?
Not right now.
Okay.
I have some ideas, but I was like the last cartoonist to make comics for the Village Voice before I died. and it was this weird experience where I actually was getting paid for like a weekly strip that came out in print. And when I got the job, I was like pregnant with my second kid that I kind of got pregnant by accident. And I didn't tell anybody, but I figured if I could do anything throughout having my giving birth, I could be just making one strip. Like I just do one strip a week. And then also Trump got elected. So I didn't ever think of myself as like a political cartoonist, but then I kind of became one almost by default, because what the hell else are you going to do? And now everybody's kind of exhausted. Like I don't even know. I'm glad I don't have this job right now, because it's just it would make me insane. I don't even know how you can even make a joke at this point. Like people are beyond making jokes. So so it was like a good run. It's weird to even look at this work. This was the first normal person. And I don't know, does it feel dated right now, or does it feel, I don't know if it does, but I think a lot of them do. Even like 2 weeks later they would feel dated. And so that was a really weird experience. And I'm going to edit this stuff to put it together in a book, but it'll be interesting to kind of look back on this time for us all, if we make it.
And your most recent published work is this issue of Frontier called Mother's Walk. And in a way, like you were saying, like you did the normal person strip to kind of like get through, like, you know, expecting a child again, and then getting through birth and having, you know, like a small infant again, and that was something that you were able to do. But this also is much more specifically, like directly about motherhood, and even more specifically about going through the process of giving birth. And in a way, it feels just, I mean, a little bit stylistically, but just I guess in terms of the preoccupations or what it's involved with, like a more personal, like direct comic that has a kind of relationship to the piece that's in the New Yorker.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I made these two pieces. One is like a 32-page comic just about giving birth, but also how time and space kind of breaks down while you're giving birth, and just a sort of meditation on mortality. And I felt like I had to get all this stuff out before I forgot it. That was like the most important thing, because this whole part of my life feels so fleeting. I mean, like my daughter just this weekend, the 2.5-year-old, just like basically potty trained herself. And like that's never, you know, she'll never wear diapers again, thank God. But it's, I feel like this kind of duty to record this stuff, also before they get too old, and then I have run into the same problem you ran into, which is writing comics about people that you care about, or like
She's gonna grow up.
Yeah, she's gonna go up and read this stuff, and so I feel like I have to just record it quickly before it goes away.
Yeah. Well, we're a bit over time, but I would like to maybe take one or two questions if anyone in the audience has a question. No, one question I'm being told is okay. Does anyone want to ask any of our panelists a question about the work? No one is brave enough to ask a single question, and despite, oh, we have one person right here. No, yeah, oh, no, that wasn't a real hand. You're trying to fob it off on someone
Questions
else.
can be asked during the signing too. I mean, it's
Okay.
Anything. Just ask me anything.
Okay,
yes,
there we go, right
one. Yes.
Hi, this question is for EA.
Oh, yes.
I'm just curious if you have published any of your writing just as writing without any images, because it seems like it's very personal essay-like, and I wondered if you had any interest in or had tried submitting any of that work
Yeah.
at other places?
So, you know, I studied like poetry in college. I thought I was going to be a poet when I grew up, which is like, you don't make money writing poetry really unless you teach or something. But I really thought like maybe I would just get book deals writing books of poetry and everything would just be swinging. No. I have not, outside of college, like I haven't really published like poetry or anything. I'm trying to think. I feel like I've been in things here and there. I don't know. I love writing, and the drawing is the hardest part for me in a lot of ways. But I love that marriage of, I mean, I like I said, I started as a poet, and then I felt like, wow, I could have an image that goes with this, and it doesn't necessarily, I'm not depicting something like traditionally in comics you might be doing. It's like,
No,
what's
I
on.
think it's wonderful, but I just
thank
wondered
you.
if you also had that.
I do think about, sometimes I'm like, oh, I want to write about culture, or sometimes, you know, there's a lot of things I think about doing, but my main ambition and the thing I enjoy the most is like finishing a comic that feels like it hit the spot for me, you know? So, but thank you for that. That's nice to hear.
All right, we really fortunately have time, but we will be signing books, and that would be a great time to ask any other outstanding questions, which are now bubbling to the surface. So we'll be signing books momentarily, but for this moment, please join me in thanking all of our great panelists for being here tonight and sharing so much.
For the record, I'm sorry to cut it short, guys. Please feel free to ask your questions during the signing. Oh, this is a hot mic.